Good afternoon, everyone. We're very excited to be here. We're going to talk to you today about connected brands and the power of language, and we're from RGA. So I guess first off, we'll go through. Jennifer, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Jennifer Vano, and I am the head of Verbal Design, a creative director. And Verbal Design, we'll talk in more detail about, but it is the discipline that deals with brand language, and we'll get into some of the details later.
All right. I'm Gus. Obviously, I'm in desperate need of a new headshot, but we'll get to that. But essentially, yeah, so we're from RGA. And for those of you who didn't know that brand is a practice within RGA, essentially it all was born out of this, visceral belief, really, that brand belongs in the boardroom. And in order to do that, actually, we forged a department which is called Brand Transformation, which is essentially bringing together innovation, consulting, and brand. But we're not making this up. We all come from the branding industry. We've come from this kind of broad spectrum of brand. Hopefully you recognize some of these agencies up here, and we're incredibly proud to be alum of these agencies. But what it's done, more importantly, has given us a bit of a breadth of experience and definitely opinions of what makes a great brand. And ultimately, it comes down to these four key things. Essentially, we believe that a great brand is great strategy made visual, verbal, and experiential. But often, these individual crafts are treated as just that, individual, right? And they rarely work together, or at least seldom are in pursuit of the same outcome. Whereas actually, as we all know, that to create truly innovative, connected brands, you need to work way more iteratively, way more collaboratively, which is why actually we believe that all of these disciplines need to work together, regardless of what your craft. So we call this philosophy connected brands. And what we mean by connected brands is essentially this. Connected brands, or when you think about branding or storytelling in general, it always started with the story, the killer idea. The problem, and that worked for many, many years. An entire industry was built on it. But ultimately, when you think about it, they're quite passive behaviors. You would kind of think about this great metaphor, this idea, you would read about it, you'd listen about it, or you'd ultimately kind of watch it on TV. Whereas as we know today that ultimately the way we connect with brands is way more experiential and more behavioral, right? Actually, it's like the tweeting, swiping, slacking, Venmoing, swiping, and that direct connection with a brand from a user is actually incredibly important, which is why it's not just the story and the idea that we need to drive, but actually the systematic, bottom-up, cultural approach on how to build a great brand. So we kind of think of those two things together. How do you take the story, what we say, and the system, what we do, and work to build a more holistic brand experience? Another way to think about this is through signifiers and behaviors. A signifier, the things you'll kind of more traditionally associate with a brand, the name, the logo, color palette, grid system, etc. But then there's the behavior, how the brand experience lives, how it adapts, how it connects to the user. And all those things together create a much better, more holistic brand experience. Great example here, a long-standing client of ours. Can't take credit for this redesign, but we're huge fans of it. When the Google rebrand was announced, you look at it from on the surface level and you go, okay, it's like a bit more slick, sans serif type. They've kind of kept the googly color palette. It feels clean and modern like some of their competitors. Fantastic. But actually the real magic behind this rebrand was that they realized their future was going to be driven in AI. And ultimately the Google Assistant was going to be a core part of that. So what they did, they structured their entire rebrand around behavior, around that brand experience. And the identity shifted to become more behavioral, to prepare Google's business to move into a more conversational interface. And what's amazing about that is then that enables you to take that from a rebrand and transition into more behaviorally driven marketing, shifting from campaigns being rooted in traditional metaphor, and then actually going to actually thinking about how it can play a key role in people's lives.
And this makes a lot of sense for Google because Google's whole business is built on language, even from search and now as they move into conversation design. So of course they would be thinking about behavior that is rooted in the spoken word. In fact, they put a stake in the ground and went so far as to say the future really is about the spoken word, not traditional interface as we've thought about it before. But we think that you don't have to be a technology company or a company that's using AI or chat or conversational design at all to really benefit from thinking about language and the power of words in a different way. Because whether you are using traditional forms of communication or building a conversational interface or just building an experience, whether that's digital or physical, you're having a conversation with your consumer. You're telling them something, and there is an exchange. And so words really, really do matter. So when we got together to really think about how we could give language and words the right seat at the table when it came to branding at RGA, we looked back on what our experience with brand language had been in the past, and I'm sure this won't be surprising to many of you, but we found that there are two typical approaches that tend to happen in the branding world when it comes to language. So either we have something like this, where there's a really robust strategy phase defining what the brand is all about, and then verbal and visual split and build identities separate from each other, and somewhere in the guidelining phase they come together. It's a mashup, you hope it works together, but there was no exchange between the two. It really wasn't an integrated design at all. Or what happens, which is more unfortunate, is that writing isn't considered in the brand process at all, and it really is seen as something that happens later as an additive. Can you wordsmith something? Can we add a headline? But it's seen as something separate to brand design altogether. And then that got us thinking, well, when we think about all the disciplines, all the crafts that are part of branding and beyond, we attach this word design to them. Visual design, experience design, product design, industrial design, the list goes on. But when it comes to language, we talk about it differently. It's verbal strategy, verbal identity, voice, personality. And why isn't language associated with design?
And it's weird, right? Because when you think about design and break it down into what it's trying to achieve, there's no specific craft associated with it, really. Like, design is both strategic and creative. Of course, being able to not just come up with a strategy, but understand how to communicate that strategy is key. It's the foundational building blocks of how you continue to build on that strategy going forward. Design solves problems. You know, if you've solved a problem, how do you communicate it? How do you communicate that solution, and how is that solution then translating, not just through a logo, not just through a grid structure, but actually then rooted in the very way we communicate to whoever the audience might be. And then ultimately, design is not a discipline, it's an approach. And I think this is a key theme we want to talk about today, is actually then how do we actually start to think about if we are all in service of solving problems, then how do we remove the idea of that being attached to a specific craft and actually bring more people into the conversation?
So of course, this is all to say that language is design. So the first thing that we did was call the discipline what we believe it's deserving of. Language at its best is design, so let's call our practice verbal design. And really, I think this is one step in helping us treat verbal design differently, because we were talking about it differently, so we were treating it as something other than other crafts. But of course, semantics is not everything. We really do need to put our money where our mouth is. So what do we mean by verbal design, and how is it different? For one, it's output focused. It's not about theory that sits in guidelines. It's about finding actionable ways to activate language and empowering every writer, and even others who are not writers by trade, to use language in the right way. It's also dynamic. It's not a single identity that's static. It evolves as contexts evolve, as people evolve. It's truly a system, just like visual and experience are. It's all-encompassing. It means it touches every word everywhere. It starts with names, it carries through to long copy, even UX copy. You know, every word matters. It also is inclusive of traditional and non-traditional forms of communication. And perhaps most importantly, it's foundational. It's not a supplement or something that happens at the end. It is part of the brand foundation. In sum, we define verbal design as the craft of designing an approach to conversation that a brand has everywhere. And that starts with language. So what does this really mean for our day-to-day? Well, we take a page out of advertising's book, inspired by the beautiful partnership that has worked for decades of copy and art, right? Advertising has always respected that these crafts should come together. So we bring disciplines together, verbal, visual, and experience, from the very, very beginning, to be thinking about the brand idea, not necessarily just about these different crafts, but what is the overarching idea, and more importantly, what's the character of the brand? What's the essence that we want to bring to life? And when you start to do that, and you think about language as something more fundamental, you actually start to ask different questions about what words can do in your brand. So instead of how can I wordsmith this, which far too often happens, we can ask, what is the idea, and how can words actually be a vehicle for unlocking the potential of that idea and bringing it forward? instead of asking, what do people want to hear, and just sort of trying to mirror what you think your audience wants, we start by asking, what is authentic to us? What do we have the right to say? And then how can we meet audiences where they are? Instead of just thinking about how a line sounds, or how a word sounds, we think about how we want to make people feel, really carrying that idea of character through. If this is a conversation, there is an outcome, not only based on the content, but the tone and how people are walking away feeling. And ultimately, how does this all add up? It's not about single lines or single words. It's about the totality of what you're saying and the whole conversation. And when you ask these questions and think about language in this way, you really can start to create a cohesive experience. And that's because everything is coming from the same place. It doesn't just happen. It feels like it's coming from the same place because it is. And so ultimately what this means is that verbal design really can be that connected thread in a connected brand system, driving your story in your system and connecting all of your experiences together.
All right, and then we just wanted to take you through a quick example of how, especially from like a visual design standpoint, just how that can be so inspiring as a foundational insight and idea, and how we can extend that into a system. So we just wanted to talk to you about a client that came to us, Silk Inc. We were incredibly fortunate to work with this unbelievable company that came to us. And they essentially asked us to do a couple of things. They wanted us to help define and build their brand. But to tell you a little bit about Silk Inc., Silk Inc. Really starts with these three amazing people. The first two are Greg Altman and Rebecca LeCouture. They are both biochemists. They actually met at Tufts University, and they shared this passion for finding healthier, safer alternatives to harmful petrochemicals. And then the third member of this story is actually Greg's wife, Rebecca Altman, and she is an environmental sociologist, which is essentially the study of not just pollution in the planet, but actually the pollution of the body, which sounds terrifying, right? So we'll get into that a little bit. And essentially, this is, we are in the midst of this invisible crisis. Essentially, nearly everything we wear, everything we put on our skin, the seats you're sitting in right now, they're all coated in harmful petrochemicals to achieve a benefit. It might be water wicking, it might be an emulsifier in your moisturizer, whatever, right? But essentially, these things are not only harmful to the body, they also end up just going into our water supply and eventually our food supply. It gets better, don't worry. So amazingly, Greg and Beck actually found this incredible solution, this natural alternative in the form of a humble, pure silk cocoon. And what they do with this silk cocoon is pretty astounding. They literally just take it, they add water and salt, they put it in a hydrofuge, and then they create this property they call activated silk, liquid silk. It's kind of like a gel. But then by combining different properties with this liquid silk, this activated silk, you can essentially match or outperform any benefit that a petrochemical can do, but without any of the harmful, I guess, results, experiences, right? So pretty astounding. The most, even more incredible than that is it doesn't disrupt the manufacturing process at all. Manufacturers around the world can still order this substance as they would order any petrochemical and seamlessly put it into their supply chain. That's incredible. Can we just think about that for a second? That's mad. So essentially, they came to us and thought about the opportunity was enormous, and it was a huge privilege, which was how do we help them try to build this brand, communicate this product, and essentially disrupt entire industries, not just the chemical industry to competitors such as DuPont, but also actually disrupt the fashion industry, the health industry, the medical industry, and beyond.
And as Gus said, we needed to brand them and help build their business, right? But there are a couple of challenges here. One, the science is actually really, really complicated. At its base, it seems simple, but there's so much to tell. But more, the problem, as Gus was explaining, and the solution are both invisible. So how do we get people to even understand that there are chemicals and additives that can harm us and our bodies on everything we buy and touch, but also buy into the fact that there's this invisible solution from silk that's not changing your clothing or your products, but making it better. So that's really tough, right? We need to bring it to the fore and help people get passionate about it. The other challenge here was that silk knew that they couldn't do this alone. The technology, the science is amazing, but they're not going to start manufacturing chairs and skincare and leggings, right? They need to work with partners across the board in every industry who are the leaders in these different areas to actually replace the chemicals with activated silk. So we need to be thinking about mass and luxury, everything from tires to food to high fashion, and even globally too. So how do we create a brand that can work in all of those places? So where do we begin? Of course, it always starts with strategy and what we call an active purpose. An active purpose defines the role as well as the impact of the brand. So for Silk, what we defined was that they're a green chemistry company that exists to advance the world's health by unlocking the power of nature's most elegant chemistry. So a lot of beautiful things here. Advance the world's health is about the people and the planet. Unlocking nature's most elegant chemistry really means bringing science and nature together to bring out what was already there and make it better, to change everything. So we have our strategy, but now we need a name. They came to us as Silk Inc., as we said, but that name really wasn't working very hard for them. It really wasn't serving as a tool to communicate their purpose or the potential impact that they could have. So when we think about naming, and of course naming is a key component of verbal design, we think about some standard criteria that I'm sure a lot of you have seen or worked with if you've been through a naming process. We need to connect to the strategy through the name. We need to make a good first impression. We need to find a name that can grow with the business as it evolves. And we need to be able to own the name. And it needs to be clear from any unsavory connotations or perceptions in key languages. But we don't want just a good name, and yes, all those things are true. We want a great name. So for us, because we think about brands a little bit differently, we think about that story and that system, we think a great name plays one more role. And we give ourselves one more challenge, as if naming isn't hard enough. And that's to really find a name that can bridge story and system. So yes, it's inspired by your strategy and what you believe and what you have to say, but it also should unlock a world. And we'll show you a little bit about what that means as we go through. So how do you get there? It starts with thousands of names. Naming is really, really hard. A lot of blood, sweat, and tears goes into naming. I'm sure you all know.
Many tears.
Many name deaths along the way, but that's okay. We're working together, visual, verbal, and experience, again, to come up with names and test and learn as we go. So what is that story in the name? And then what are those system ideas? Is this unlocking anything? What's the potential? And we keep doing this iteratively, wow, on an iterative basis until we come up with 8 or 10 that are really powerful and can connect that story and system. And that's what we did for Silk. And then we get to our one chosen name. And for us, even though we presented 10 great names, there was really one name that was bubbling to the top as the winner. And that was Evolved by Nature. So we love this name for a lot of reasons. First, it's really a beautiful shorthand for that strategy. Remember, the strategy was about advancing the world's health. That's evolved by unlocking nature's most elegant chemistry by nature. So it really does tell the story really beautifully. But what makes it a really great name is that it's a platform for starting a conversation with brands and consumers alike. That conversation that needs to be had about the invisible problems and the invisible solutions. And the reason this name can do that is because it's actually designed to tell you the benefit without having to work too hard, right? So you know that something has been evolved. That's inherently a good thing. And it implies a before state. So we're not telling you that there were negative petrochemicals there before. We can tell you that later. But we may be piquing your interest. We may be inspiring some questions. What's been evolved? What does that mean? How did nature come into play here? But then when you think about, I can't go back there, but when you think about partnerships, it really does work in tandem with every partner name. So if you have Chanel locked up with Evolved by Nature, Nike, Evolved by Nature, if you read that as a single idea, you can understand that Chanel or Nike have been evolved by nature, which creates this value exchange between the two brands. And we'll show you a little bit more how that works. The other thing we loved about this name was this little verbal gift in it. So this by nature part. We can take this and pair it with a brand level benefit, like cleaner, or I think there's just a little lag here, sorry, or a product level benefit like stronger, to start to tell a more complete story about what Evolved by Nature means and what it does.
All right. So then what happens is, how do we do that? So we know our name starts a conversation, right? So that we know that's key to getting people understand what this Evolved by Nature platform is, but then shouldn't language be integral to that entire brand expression? So in other words, how does then verbal design inform both those signifiers and behaviors? So what we did, as you know, EBN is, as you now know, EBN is this green chemistry company. But what's interesting is that when we start with a name, it's built to engage a conversation with people, right? But when we think about language and verbal design are being extremely important, then of course from a design standpoint, a visual design standpoint, then type itself needs to be extremely important, right? So what happens then is we wanted to think about how we could continue that conversation around evolution into the typeface itself. We know there's this kind of juxtaposition between science and nature. So we really wanted that to be something where we could start with this pure natural silk cocoon, obviously the nature, but then end with this groundbreaking science which can disrupt industries, being obviously the science portion of this, right? So not rocket science, we went back to this idea of serif and sans, but what we got really excited about was actually the evolution itself is extremely dynamic. So we can't just have a static typeface, and it can't be set in a single type weight or a single style. So we worked with this amazing typographer from Paris to try and think about how we could create this variable typeface, which is constantly transitioning and programmatically evolving from one state to the other. What's cool about that for us, or at least was cool to us, is we could start to build this system where we're constantly in flux, and whatever conversation we need to say, whatever amount of gravitas we need or sophistication we need, depending on the partner brand, the language, the brand itself, the behavior could flex. So what we wanted to think about there was then if we're a verbally driven brand, and that illustrates both problems and solutions, and we can use typeface as a vehicle for that story of evolution, but what we also needed was a visual signifier. How do we actually have a shorthand for this? And ultimately, is there another way that we can reveal there's something more to be discovered? Being a verbally driven brand, we went back to language, and there was this beautiful gift in the idea of an annotation, or more specifically, the asterisk. The asterisk being a symbol where when you see it, you know there's something more to be discovered. And we got really excited about that, because a big problem, as we mentioned, was just like we need a way to give people, let people know there's something there so they can discover more without explicitly calling it out. But the interesting thing about the asterisk today is it's almost used in the opposite way, like it's used to hide something. Rarely will you ever look into what an asterisk is actually calling out. So we wanted to shift that behavior from the asterisk being a negative thing to actually, or being harmful chemicals, to actually something that's harmless for you. So we put those two things together, and when they're put together, that asterisk can trigger that evolution. Whatever Evolved by Nature is providing to the brand, we can then activate it and start to generate a conversation around it. And that was kind of what ended up, this is the static form of the brand, but we wanted to kind of bake that evolution into it. It brings the benefit to the fore, but it also creates a platform to start that story. Obviously, variable type is quite sophisticated. This was a startup, and it's grown now, but still, there are people who can't necessarily flex and work with variable type. So we built a script into it. So in whatever platform you were in, whether it be Microsoft Word or PowerPoint, all you needed to do was just add that asterisk, and it would automatically trigger the latest word that stood next to it. So what was great is the idea we had this kind of symbol for change, which we thought was really powerful. It pays off on the questions, it can answer them, it can anticipate them, but then most importantly, it creates a conversation and interaction with the consumer. So it's that signifier and behavior coming together.
So now with our visual design and our verbal design coming together, we actually don't have to say a whole lot to say a lot. So you can use the asterisk strategically placed on a product, in this case, the leggings, with a simple benefit. And the payoff, if you can see on the left-hand side there, or I guess it's your right-hand side, the brand becomes the payoff. So you understand that the moisture wicking is brought to you by Evolved by Nature. And then, as I was mentioning before, that verbal gift, that by nature part, can work really well, especially in motion, but also in static, to start to tell more of the story over time.
And yeah, and like as Jen was talking about earlier, like we can actually then kind of use that verbal gift. It kind of creates these partnerships. But again, what's been fantastic to see is they've been going to speak with partners. It makes it a very unobtrusive way to actually be a partner. So what's fantastic is we're starting to see a lot of quite large companies who are both investing in the company and like committing to this, Chanel being one, and others being announced soon. But ultimately, what is great about that, it gives us this incredible flexibility to continue that conversation. And this is an important point. Do you want to explain?
Yeah, absolutely. So we said that this is a verbally driven brand, and that started with the name. But of course, you have to say more eventually. We don't want to leave people hanging. So what we created was this systematic approach where you can have the flexibility to say more, say less, create more intrigue, then pay off with education in different ways, all the while using all of the tools in our toolkit to connect with people and let them know what they need to know, which is that there is something there that they need to pay attention to.
So as again, I mean, this kind of goes on, but as you can see, like having this verbally led system gives us a lot of flexibility. We can describe a lot or a little. We can start to bring people into the story.
Yeah, so I think we knew that not only brands were important, but that consumers are important and influencers too. So here, we can use that phrasal construct of the name to say something like created by, let's say, Outdoor Voices, worn by Kayla, who's a fitness influencer, and evolved by nature. So you get all parts of the story, all the people and players involved in one small space.
And the hope is over time that it becomes a standards mark as well, that hopefully we'll start, just as in the, like 10 years ago, you started to see the organic mark appearing on your groceries. The hope is that at one point you start to see this mark that can symbolize that there are no more harmful petrochemicals in this product you're buying. And ultimately, we wanted to build this a B2B2C brand. So not just a business that trades in chemicals, but ultimately one that can both flex to also relate to consumers from a mission standpoint as well. So that was the case study of going together of how we think verbal design can be like really powerful and unlock the idea behind an entire brand. And we just got a couple of final thoughts.
Yeah, so hopefully you walk away understanding that today a brand really must be connected. We have to bring story and system together, thinking about both at the same time and letting both influence the other. And then, of course, verbal design can be a really essential thread in that system. So it always has a role in connecting the two. But sometimes it really can unlock the whole idea. And you could have a brand world that's built on language and on the power of verbal design. And ultimately, as you do think about how brand interactions are changing, we really are primed for a future in which verbal design and experience design are truly one and the same. And even brand design itself, as our primary way of interacting with brands, is shifting to be more language and conversation based.
And I think that kind of just leaves with this final thought is that what we're really excited about, and I think what we've all learned working together at RGA, is that designers above everything need to be connectors, not just kind of focus on our own craft, but actually ask the right questions and think about how together we can make those connections amongst people's perspectives, crafts, and then ultimately create more powerful ideas and impact going forward. And that's it.
Thank you.